I'm emailing Rebecca, just so everybody knows.
Okay. Good evening, and thank you so very much for joining us. This is our first public meeting for the Community Budget Committee, and we just want to say thank you to all of our committee members. And next slide, please. This committee is actually going to be operated by our Deputy Superintendent, Kimberly Roaring, and we will go through a brief introduction of our committee meetings, the expectations, and then provide a fiscal update. We'll look at the rollover budget review, and then we'll talk about the next meeting dates and topics. If you are watching this via live stream, we ask that if you have any comments or questions, we would not be able to respond to them in real time, but we're asking that you submit your information to boe@albany.k12.ny.us. That's boe@albany.k12.ny.us. So with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Ms. Roaring, our Deputy Superintendent of Business and Finance.
Thank you, Superintendent Adams. On the screen, we have our agenda for this evening. We're going to introduce our committee members. We will then talk about committee expectations, provide our update on our 2021 fiscal year, look at our rollover budget, and then share out our next meeting dates and the topics that will be covered.
We do ask that everyone please mute so that we can reduce the background noise. Thank you.
So our 5 committee members include Ms. Dana Brown. She works with SUNY Empire as the Director of Opportunity Programs and is responsible for overseeing program budgets and grants. Mr. Scott Dolan is with Excelsior College. He's the Dean of Graduate Studies there. Ms. Dahlia Herring is with us as well. She's retired from the New York State Division of Budget and New York State Education Department in several positions. Mr. Mansour Khan is with us as well. He's with SUNY Albany as a program manager and analyst, and Ms. Rebecca Zimmerman is our final member of the committee. She is a chemist with SUNY Polytechnic and has served as a volunteer treasurer for several organizations in our community, including some in the district. 4 out of 5
We do have 2 of our board members who are listening into the meeting, President Ann Savage and Vice President Vicki Smith.
Thank you, Superintendent Adams. In looking at some of the expectations for the committee, we just wanted to kind of walk through these quickly. It is expected that the committee will work together with district staff over the next 4 weeks or so to gain a deeper understanding of our annual budget process, review district expenditures, revenue sources, mandated programs, services, and resource allocation in support of the district's vision, mission, and goals, provide input from the community for the board to consider from a community equity and priority lens as the budget proposal for the 21-22 school year is being developed, meet 4 times during the budget development process in live stream sessions. So we want to make sure that there's an opportunity for members in the community to observe our work and ask questions about what we're doing. An update on our 2021 fiscal year includes looking at the COVID fiscal impact. Back in the summer, August 20th, we were notified by the Division of Budget that without federal relief for COVID expenditures, they would begin withholding 20% of state aid payments. For the district, 20% of foundation aid was $16.5 million, and 20% of all of our state aid would be $23.2 million. In response to this information, in September, the district made a very painful yet fiscally responsible decision to eliminate $15 million in expense from our 2021 budget. This included 215.6 positions in our district, or roughly 13% of our anticipated aid from the state for this year. Additional factors we have to consider: school districts are limited to 4% in unallocated fund balance. That 4% is a calculation of what your expense budget is. So for us, it's a little over $10 million of unappropriated fund balance. This gives us a much smaller unrestricted reserve than other municipalities are able to have. We have limited flexibility. Our unallocated fund balance at the end of fiscal 2019-20 was $4.8 million. And as part of our 2021 budget development, we committed 50% of that, or $2.4 million, to the 2021 revenue budget. School districts can hold restricted reserves. However, use of these funds is not generally permitted for operating expenses. Those reserves are in place for very specific reasons. We did have a recent law that was passed as part of the budget process last year at the state level that allows us to borrow from those restricted reserves, but it must be paid back in at least 20% per year over 5 years. And it can only be used for COVID-19 pandemic related expenditures. The district received our first state aid payments for the 2021 fiscal year in full. Those were September and October payments, which totaled just under $21 million, or about 17.6% of our total anticipated $118.6 million in state aid for this fiscal year. In November, the state withheld approximately $700,000 from our anticipated aid payment. However, they did provide guidance on how those funds may be accessed later in 2021, and that $700,000 is part of the pandemic relief or the CARES Act funding. Our supplemental charter school tuition payment was also reduced by 20%, or a little over $302,000. This happened in the December-January timeframe. So through December, we have received $35.3 million of our anticipated $118.6 million in state aid, or just under 30%. Typically, we receive about 66% of our total state aid between March and September. When we look at the fiscal impact from a dollars perspective, this chart depicts several different areas where we've had reductions in funds. If we look at the top line in the chart, you'll see our 2019-20 state aid has been withheld by just about $2 million. So there was funds from the prior year that had been unpaid to that time, and the state began making reductions in those as well. We have unreimbursed transportation expenditures from the end of last year of $463,000. The 2020-21 state aid so far was about $700,000 withheld in that November month payment, and then about $302,000 withheld in December and January, for a total of just over $1 million. In unplanned COVID-19 expenditures, we're just about $941,000 through December 31st. We also note here in the second bullet that deducted from the state's original proposed 2021 budget for the Albany City School District was $2 million. And that takes us to a total fiscal impact of 6.35. So looking ahead, what this means for us, for 21-22 fiscal year and beyond, we recognize that the economic impact of the pandemic is expected to continue for multiple years. We're going to continue to analyze data to make sound fiscal decisions that will allow us to maintain our fiscal responsibility to our community, but also providing high quality academic support programs for our students that they need and deserve. So in operation, that means our budgets are status quo. We are looking at a strategic rebuilding based on the Division of Budget and SED guidance for our revenue. Innovative instructional delivery and programs for our students. Looking at how we can continue to grow student achievement and improve proficiency. Classroom observations are occurring in person and virtually, and our instructional model requirements include face covering, social distancing, cleaning and disinfecting, space available in room size, and our building capacity. Looking at how our budget process proceeds. We have a couple of meetings with the Community Budget Committee over the next week or so. On February 11th, we have a budget update to the board, which will include a first look at 2021-22 revenue. On March 1st, we meet with the Community Budget Committee again to finalize some input and feedback that can be shared out with the board as they continue to move through the budget development process. We have community budget meetings during the week of March 8th, and those are expected to be virtual to really allow greater participation and attendance by our community so we can hear directly from them. The proposed budget will be shared with the Board of Education on April 1st. The board will adopt the budget either April 15th or April 22nd is expected. We have our public hearing on May 6th, and then our annual vote occurs on May 18th. Looking at our rollover budget, some of the assumptions that are part of that process include continuation of all of our existing programs and services and staffing and benefits at our current levels in compliance with our labor contracts. That also includes continuation of our contractual obligations, such as maybe for student transportation or related services for our special education students. Continuation of our district operations and adjustments to specific budget lines to fund contractual obligations and align with 3-year average costs to meet our students' needs. The rollover budget does not include addressing mandates that require more resources or other items that may be considered essential for programming, health, and safety for our students and staff. Cost drivers in our rollover budget for 21-22 include an overall increase in benefits of just over $1 million. We have an increase in our debt service of just over $1.5 million, and there's a little asterisk there that notes at a future meeting with the Board of Education we'll be providing some additional information on debt service. Our out-of-district tuition is expected to go up about $253,000. We have a reduction in our overall salary expenditure, which is associated with the reduction in force. So it is important to note that the rollover budget does include contractual salary increases for our current staff. We funded summer school in summer of 2020. This was able to be covered by grants. And then looking at our contractual increases in transportation of $234,000. So when we compare it year over year, our rollover expense budget for 21-22 is actually a decrease of just under $5 million or 1.9%, down to $256.59 million. There are several budget variables that will become clearer or fine-tuned over the next few weeks or couple months as we move through this process. As we know, state aid is something that is being worked on right now in the Capitol with the legislature. That is typically not finalized until the end of March, as that budget is due for adoption on April 1st at the state level. We have health insurance increases anticipated for 21-22. We are continuing to work with our third-party administrator around those estimates of expenditure for next year, and that is finalized in March as well. The tax cap calculation will be done this month and submitted to the State Comptroller's Office by March 1st deadline. Our tax levy is set when the board adopts the budget in April. Looking at the impact of any retirements we may have from staff this year, and then the continuing impact of COVID-19. And this is something that we're looking at very closely so we can make sure that we're planning to accommodate those continued needs that we expect for next year. Looking at next steps in the process, we'll be finalizing the district's priorities, receiving input from the Community Budget Committee, incorporating new information as it becomes available, and continuing to review all of our projections for expenditures and revenue, as well as the assumptions that we've made, respond to board questions, incorporate feedback from the board, our community, and staff, and continue our lobbying efforts for additional state aid. Upcoming meeting dates for the Community Budget Committee include Monday, February 8th. At that meeting, we're going to take a more detailed look at the various sources of funds for revenue. Some come from the state, local, federal level, and there's other sources. And so we're just going to take some time to kind of better understand that and take an initial look at the 21-22 revenue projection. Our following meeting will be February 22nd. There we're going to review the district mission, vision, and goals and have a conversation about mandated versus non-mandated expenditures to develop a better understanding of those. And then discuss the community's priorities and hear from our members on the committee. March 1st, we're going to take a look at our debt service as a district and then have a follow-up conversation and some final thoughts on community priorities from our members that we can share out with the Board of Education. So that's really our information sharing piece, and I would open it up to members of the committee for any questions that you have or anything you want to talk about a little bit more.
At this time, committee members, you can unmute so that not necessarily all at one time, but if you wanted to ask a question, please go ahead and unmute. And we can go back to any slides that you want to reference that you may have questions about.
Hi, this is Mansoor Khan.
Hello.
Hi, Kimberly, is it possible for you to go back to, I think there was a slide earlier on about cost drivers?
Yes.
And if you wouldn't mind reviewing that again.
Okay. So when we look at our 21-22 rollover expense budget, we really looked at those things that are going to have the most significant impact on our total expense budget. And this year we have a net increase in benefits of just over $1 million. So we know our the rates for the retirement systems that our faculty and staff participate in are going up for next year. But overall cost on those is not as significant because of the reduction in force that we had in September. What's really causing that to be about $1 million is a reduction in our Social Security Medicare contribution as an employer. And that is offsetting in substantial the increase in our health insurance that we're expecting for next year. So next year's health insurance increase is expected to be about $2.5 million. So we're going to see about 1.5 million roughly in savings from our Social Security contributions to bring us into that net $1 million increase in benefits. When we look at our debt service on capital projects, this is something we're going to talk about a lot more in our fourth meeting, but just high level looking at that, we have an increase difference between what our debt service expenditures are and what our building aid will be. And that we also have an increase in our debt service associated with our ongoing construction. So many of you, I'm sure, have seen the extensive construction that's occurring at Albany High School. We are in phase 3 of that renovation to that campus and build out. There are costs associated with that project that are part of our short-term borrowing in that debt service number, as well as the May 2019 capital project proposition that the community approved. And that included extensive renovations at North Albany Middle School. Arbor Hill will have interior renovations done to it as well, and about 14 of our other buildings will be impacted by that proposition. So that touches almost all of our buildings with the exception of Albany High. And that is also increasing our short-term borrowing expense. So overall, we have that $1.5 million increase year over year. Our out-of-district tuition, those are rates that are really not in our control. And they go up anywhere from 3 to 5 or 7% in any given year. So this includes a small rate increase year over year for the students who are attending programs outside of our district. Salaries, as I indicated, was a net effect of just about $8.4 million, and that is due to the reduction of force the district had at the end of September 2020. And it does include the net effect is with the increase in salaries for our employees currently in the district in accordance with their contracts. Summer school was something that we were able to fund in grants for the 2020 year. That program is expected to return to the general fund for the 21 year. So we needed to add those funds back into the budget, which is just about $600,000, so that we can offer that summer programming for our students. And then we have contractual increases in our transportation contracts that occur every year. And that is that effect of that transportation rate increase with our contracts of $234,000. Did that help answer the question?
Yes, thank you. I just needed some help going over that again. Thank you.
I have just a quick question. This is Scott Dolan. Stepping back a little bit in terms of the explanation about the rollover budget. Is that's basically a rollover budget based on the state fiscal year and the fact that the school year straddles the two pieces? Is that what am I understanding that correctly?
So our fiscal year starts July 1st and ends on June 30th, which is a little out of sync with the state. They start April 1st and end on March 31st. Our rollover budget would be looking at the costs for our fiscal year of July to June. So our revenue picture becomes clear at the end of March because that's when the state approves their expenditure budget for the next year. And that really helps guide the information that we have to finalize our budget from a revenue perspective.
Got it. And so this slide here is telling us a bit more about the next slide where we're seeing the $4 million Got it.
Yes. So this side is this is talking really about the expense side rather than the revenue picture right now, and it's a rollover expense budget. So all we've looked at in this particular series of slides is what we expect our expenditures to be for next year if everything remains exactly as it is now.
Perfect. Thank you.
Tanya, can you go to slide 13 because I just want to make sure that that's clear. So in this table here, we have the 2021 adopted budget of $261.5 million. Our rollover is actually expected to be less than our 2021 adopted budget because of the reductions that were made in September. So as we sit right now, our rollover is just about $5 million less than what our adopted budget was for 2021. Are there any other questions or comments that I may assist with?
Ms. Rory,
Mhm.
could you clarify just in a little bit more detail how the cost drivers impact the rollover budget? Or is there an impact?
So really the cost drivers are trying to highlight some of the biggest factors in that rollover budget and the adjustments to the status quo, basically, because we're saying we're maintaining the status quo, but the status quo doesn't cost us the same thing next year. So that is maintaining our status quo. We maintain our staff, we maintain our programming, we maintain our contracts for transportation and things like that. And the expense of doing that next year is expected to be $256.5 million. Does that help clarify that?
Thank you.
So
Hi.
basically, I guess, sorry, I'm trying to explain it in my head. Basically, net of any changes in the revenue side, right? The city is going to have to reduce the budget by $5 million, by about 2% from last year, based on the cost structure, right? Based on expenses.
So what I really want to highlight here is the rollover expense budget, and really stress that we haven't looked at revenue yet.
Right.
So we don't know if the revenue and expense are in sync, if there's more revenue or less revenue. That's part of what we're going to look at next Monday. So right here, what we're saying is to maintain our status quo as we sit now will actually cost us about $5 million less next year. And then next week, we'll try to put those two things together to help, identify where the rollover expense sits against anticipated revenue that we have at this time. Does that help clarify that?
It does. Yeah, I'm jumping ahead in my head.
Okay.
Thank you.
But those are really good questions because we're breaking it apart so that once we put it together, that there's a clear understanding of the expense and making sure that we are clear. We also have to be clear about which school year or fiscal year that we're operating in. And that goes back to the conversations that we've had at the board meetings about at the very beginning of the meeting with the district update, we're going to be looking at this current school year because there are significant impacts for the 2021 school year. And then we have a standing budget presentation about the 21-22 school year, because what voters will be looking at is that budget for the 21-22 school year. And so we're going to try to look at them separate, but also at the same time, because there may be significant impacts this current year that will lead us to some decisions for the 21-22 school year.
I think the other part of that is really trying to just take an opportunity to look a little bit deeper at the two separate areas that comprise that overall picture, and really diving in a little bit more next week to the revenue and the various sources the district has, because it isn't just state aid or taxes. And we really want to bring some clarity around that so that there's an understanding of the various ways that we derive revenue to support the programs that we offer our students.
Deputy Superintendent, I have a question for you regarding the, let me just go back. I believe it's slide 7, the district update overview. And I believe the slide says in November, the state withheld approximately $700,000 and then encapsulated the additional cut to the charter school tuition payment. Has there been any conversation about, you know, figuring out that deficit and, you know, like what's going on with the state and if there's a plan? I mean, I know that some of those questions will be answered once, you know, more budgeting rolls out from the state, but has there been any further conversation about that and, you know, meeting those needs where those cuts were made?
For 2021?
Yes.
I'm going to try and say your question back to you so I can see if I've understood you correctly, okay?
Okay.
So on this slide here, you're referencing the $700,000 reduction in aid that we found out about in November, correct? And that's really associated with the CARES Act funding that is being driven through now a grant process. So we are in queue for that grant review and approval process. The supplemental charter tuition payment, we get aid. We have 2 different small revenue streams to support the charter school tuition payments that we make. And in 2021, that was anticipated to be about $35 million. And so far, we have been advised and have received that reduced payment of 20% in our first aid payment in support of charter school tuition. When we look at the reductions that we made in our district operations, we looked strictly at that which we can control, and that did not include a reduction in charter school tuition for the 2021 year. So reductions were made in other areas and other programming for our students that attend city schools. We did receive a little bit of relief in the 2021 budget from the governor and the legislature. Our rate in tuition was reduced about 5%, which helped with those costs, but we have continued to make our payments in full to the charter schools as required in statute. Did that help answer your question, or did I not at all understand what you're asking?
No, you did. And just to, I wasn't clear. I was kind of swirling around in my head, but the $700,000 that you say is now within the CARES Act. If I'm not mistaken, CARES is something that was you know, that came out of COVID relief. So what was this 700,000 coming from before? Like, what was it before? Does that?
So this is a little complicated. So I'm going to try and explain it as best I can. And if I don't hit the mark, please feel free to tell me I need to do it a different way. Okay. Last year in the 2020-21 state aid runs, there were a couple of lines in that aid run. And one of those lines was referred to as, and I'm actually going to pull it out so I have it exactly the way they call it, because they made some tweaks to acknowledge that federal aid that we received, and that was done in 2 lines, which Josh may not be able to find it now. There was a pandemic adjustment that was made, so we lost aid of about $4.5 million. And then there was a relief adjustment, which added back $4.5 million, but it's now federal money. So what effectively happened was we had a reduction in state aid of $4.5 million. And then when that legislation was passed at the federal level and funds came to the states, those dollars were used to make us whole. But now it's federal one-time money. It's not recurring money. So initially that was rolled out to the districts from SED as part of our payment schedule. So we get a payment schedule from the state of when we should anticipate our payments. And they had planned to have about $700,000 in CARES money for us. After all the budgets were passed last year, we got guidance about the grant program and how it was going to run the application process and the parameters about how those funds could be expended. It took a little bit of time for them to make the adjustment in the payment schedule so that we would see essentially that $4.5 million come out of our state aid number. And we are now accessing that via the grant process. Did that clarify?
Yes,
all?
it does.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. And the CARES money, it sounds like it's an assumed allotment of 700,000, or is it like a competitive RFP process?
So each district was given their allocation, and we file our grant application in compliance with that overall total. Ours was 4.5 million overall. We did have to share those funds with non-public schools within the city of Albany boundaries, and we did do that in compliance, which meant the district had roughly $4.3 million of funds available to us for our programs, our staffing, and our students. They had originally taken that total and spread it out over the whole fiscal year when they were going to pay us that money. So when they made their adjustment and said, now it's a grant, we're not going to give you anything on a schedule, you have to apply, you have to be approved, and then on a grant process, it's done as a reimbursement, right? So we pay the expenditures and then we ask for the reimbursement from the state. When they made that adjustment, they adjusted the amounts we would anticipate in several months to get to that total of 4.5, and the adjustment in November was the $700,000. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it did. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Any other questions or comments?
I do have a question. If you could skip back to the 21 budget versus the 22 budget again. Can you just give us a sense of
Around slide 13, maybe, Tanya?
Yeah, exactly. Give us a sense of what percentage is personnel versus non-personnel underneath those. And I think we'll talk next meeting about mandated versus non-mandated, but do you have just a general sense of the buckets that fall underneath those budget numbers?
I wish I could say yes. I do not, so I'll take that as homework. We didn't cut the data that way in my office yet, so I don't honestly. I can tell you that typically salaries are usually 60 to 70% of our budget, and then the benefits associated with those salaries are in addition to that. So we will have more conversation about mandated versus non-mandated when we have our third meeting on the 22nd. But in the interim, we'll look at trying to dice that up a little bit differently and looking at it as a salary versus total cost.
And then quickly on the previous slide, are any of these items things that there is flexibility associated with? So one of the things you noted was that there's a renegotiation potential for the health insurance, which is expected to increase. Is that something that the district has flexibility around in terms of provider, or even how you come to the table about that number?
All right, so let me clarify a little bit here. The district for health insurance, we are self-insured. So it's a little bit different than some other organizations in our community and how they do their insurance. So our cost is really driven by actual cost and claims, right? It's not based on a certain number of employees times a premium that's told to us by the different insurance carriers. So they continue, we get our initial estimate in January, they continue to monitor those claims and expenditures that are coming in through the end of March, and then they'll give us an updated number. Last year, we were fortunate to receive a number that was a little bit less than what they originally estimated, but we aren't really in a position to negotiate because we should insure ourselves. So it's really based on our experience. We are starting to have some conversations internally in terms of what other options may be out there for us to consider. We recognize that this is a continuously increasing cost, and it's increasing at a fairly significant rate for us year over year. So we are having some of those internal conversations about, what maybe some other paths we can consider. Looking at the items on here, our benefits are prescribed. we are required to offer retirement system participation to all of our full-time staff. Our health insurance is a requirement as well. Looking at our debt service, that is something that is really driven by the approved construction projects that the community has approved and the costs associated with those. So that is an amount that is fixed that we have to pay next year. There isn't really anything that we can do to change that. I believe in the past, the district has taken advantage of some opportunities that have been available at those times to refinance some of our bonds, which lowered our overall costs. So that was great. We have consulted with our fiscal advisors, and right now there really isn't an opportunity for us to do that. We're really in probably the best position we can get in that from our conversations with them. So something that we look at each year to see if there is an opportunity to do that. And then the out of district tuition, those tuition rates are set by the state, and the programs are prescribed by the Committee on Special Education. So that really isn't something that we drive as an organization. It's something that's really driven to make sure that we meet the needs of our students as best as we can, to help them have access to their free and appropriate public education. Summer school is it's a program that we offer our students. So there may be some pieces of that that could be considered mandated versus non-mandated, and that's something we're going to have a more full conversation on again on February 22nd. And transportation contracts were negotiated when the contracts were settled, and they are 5-year contracts. So the increases in those are fixed at this time. We have been working very closely. Our Director of Operations and Communications has been working very closely with our 2 providers to look at those contracts and see if there's any opportunity there to have some reduced expenditures. I will note that our reduction in expenditures for transportation does have an impact on our transportation aid, which is a source of revenue for us.
I have a question. Actually, I have 2 questions. You had mentioned that that the district, I should say, is exploring other options for the health insurance thing since the district is self-insured. If you were to go with another option, that wouldn't be effective for this upcoming year. I'm guessing it would be like a future. Okay.
That is honestly in a very early stage. Those are conversations that we have to have with our administrator and really look at whether or not there is anything out there that would be more cost effective for us. Being self-insured is sometimes a great position to be in because it can be very cost effective. But then you are, like when you look at a community plan, everybody shares in that, I'm going to call it risk, right? So when you're self-insured, there is no sharing. It's just you. So that is something that we are starting to have some very early conversations with, so that we can get a sense from them about whether or not we have an option. Are there any other options available to us? Are they more cost effective, less cost effective? And just really looking at that from a critical lens, as both myself and our Director of HR are newer to the district, and we just want to make sure that we're doing the best that we can in terms of cost in that area, while still providing the benefit to our staff.
Yeah, makes complete sense. Thank you. My second question is regarding summer school. And I know this is pointing to the current academic year, but looking ahead for 21, is there going to be any difference, or is there a plan A, plan B for like virtual, in taking that into consideration and not running something that's fully in person? Is there a difference in cost there? And then moving ahead, understanding that perhaps there will be a demand for some portion of virtual education anyway. Does that affect the budget in the way, some modeling might happen for that?
And I'm going to let Superintendent Adams, who popped on, answer that question.
So with summer school, like you can see that grant paid for 2020, the same thing will happen this coming summer. There may be some funding that we will use with grants So there would be minimal impact on our general fund. And so that does help us. However, in terms of the model, I'll put it back to where we are now. We have our in-person model for pre-K through 6th grade. And with that, we still have about 55% or so of the pre-K through 6th grade selecting virtual. That does not include 7 through 12, where there's not a choice. And so when we looked at, so if we want to compare last year's summer school to this year's summer school coming up, we would look at some of the same options that we had in terms of our highest need groups coming in person, and then what would it look like for virtual if we're able to do that. That's a staffing component as well. We also have to make sure that we take into all the other considerations, because it's more than just saying the instructional model. What are the requirements that we're going to have to put in place? Are we still looking at social distancing? Do we still have a building capacity concern with how many people can be in the building? And then do we have enough space? And so we want to make sure that all of those things are considered as we move forward. So the short answer is yes, there's always going to be a cost implication. It's how we are able to absorb the cost for the best instructional model that we can offer within the requirements that we have to abide by in delivering that model. So we will look to fund through grants as much as possible, because summer school programming is not a long-term expense. It is a budgeted expense. So the difference is using one-shot money for summer school doesn't impact the full year instructional program year after year. Whereas if we use one-shot money for what we can use general fund for, so for example, positions, those positions are only good as long as that one-shot money is good. So we would not look to use one-shot money for something that's sustainable, which is one of the reasons why we do look to our grants for most of the summer school.
Understood, thank you.
Hi, it's Mansoor again. I have a question about the net negative difference in salaries, the roughly 8.4 million. And please correct me if I am recalling this incorrectly. But last year, when the initial cuts were being put in place, I believe there was still talk of filling in some of the positions with temporary staff, correct? And does this difference in salaries take that into account? That's my first question.
So I want to clarify that. Okay, so we did not look to reduce positions simply to bring people back as substitutes or at a lesser rate. That is not advantageous for the district. It is not in the best interest of our students. That is not what that was. What we were explaining is that we had long-term substitute positions due to maternity leaves and leaves of absences. Those leaves would have taken place regardless of a reduction in force. And so in order to put people in those positions, typically we look for someone who's licensed in that area to take on that long-term sub position, be it maternity leave or leave of absence. And so when we had a reduction in force, there were, based on seniority, seeing if people were interested in taking those positions, that is what we did. So it was not that we reduced staff and we had all of these vacancies and we brought back subs. We didn't have all of those vacancies. We didn't have those vacancies because those positions were reduced, meaning they were taken out of the budget. They, in essence, did not exist as positions that could be filled. Positions that we did fill that were offered to staff that were reduced in force were our maternity leaves and leaves of absence. Does that clarify?
I think so, yes. And
So
as a follow-up.
So in other words, we would have had that expense no matter what, because those were absences that were already planned that we would have had to put substitutes in place in those positions.
Okay. And as a follow-up to the reduction in workforce, is there is it possible to see a breakdown of the kinds of services and programs that have been affected directly due to the reduction in workforce? I don't think it's part of this presentation today.
What we can do is we can send you the board presentation with regard to those from last budget season, and those areas are identified in the board presentation. So I will make a note to make sure that we send that to the committee.
Thank you.
I want to be mindful of our schedule. We did say that we were going to go to about 7. It's 6:45. Are there any other questions or comments or notes you want to make this evening on the information that was shared, or any questions you have even beyond that?
Do you have in terms of the only other thing that I mentioned that's a variable would be retirements. Do you have a sense of what percentage of staff shift into retirement on a annual basis, or is there, how does that notification process work? Does that happen at the end of the school year, or is there requirements before then?
So retirements happen throughout the year. They don't happen just at one point in time. Many people make those very personal decisions as they hit key anniversaries in the retirement system or circumstances in their personal life change. And it's important that they make that personal decision. We have a very range in terms of the number that we see year over year. I think what we've heard on a national level is that we're seeing more people choose to retire over the last couple of years than has typically happened, perhaps on a year over year basis. We are starting to look at where we may have retirements that were notified to us by the middle of January. That doesn't mean that those are going to be the only ones we see. Those are just the ones that we would know of as we start navigating the budget development process. So we'll, part of that process is assessing what those positions are, whether or not those positions as they sit need to be filled, and then we would go through that recruitment process. Mrs. Adams, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, and I do. One of the things that we look at with the retirements, especially in terms of positions that we would need to fill for the next school year, is how does that align with our programming? And if there are additional cuts to the budget, there may be other positions that have to be reduced, but then again, there may be positions that we have to build back in. And that's part of what we are doing with our administrative teams. And then moving forward, we will incorporate our teachers and support staff in that role of developing what does our instructional program look like next year.
Anything else from anyone on the committee this evening?
I think we can just add a comment with regard to Mr. Dolan, just kind of a follow-up. Are you thinking that that the reductions in the fall are temporary and that those positions would come back should we have the money?
Is that a question for me?
Yeah, I'm just trying to get the train of thought, just to make sure that I'm understanding what we're, as we're moving forward, because those are decisions that have to be made, you know, based on kind of the full complexity of strategically rebuilding. And so I'm just trying to make sure, is that the question? Is that also a question that you may have?
Yeah, I guess to me, you know, those sorts of personnel changes come with an opportunity to do a review of what the district needs to do moving forward strategically, right? So, you know, as a position goes vacant, it's an opportunity to say, okay, what does this mean now as we move forward? You know, this is a position that we for a long time thought was essential, important, but, you know, given the uncertainty of where we are now, given the fact that education's changing all the time, what does that mean as we move forward? So it's just an opportunity to evaluate in a way that does not impact other positions within the district. So I think, you know, the more proactive you can be around those sorts of things, the better off you might be around those priorities that we'll talk about next meeting.
And the same thing would happen with any vacancies that would occur even during the year. So if there are not necessarily just retirements, but, you know, there are other opportunities and people may seek those other opportunities, and then that leaves a position vacant. Depending on that position, even right now, what are we looking at? We are trying to evaluate, okay, is that a position that we need to sustain for the remainder of the year? Or is it one that we can absorb those responsibilities in other ways so that we may not incur that cost now, but we might bring it back in the fall, you know, but to go ahead and absorb that cost for the remainder of the year, it may be more prudent to do that and then bring it back full time for the next year. And I'm just speaking hypothetically, because it could very well be it needs to be returned, you know, we need to fill it right away and still continue that for the next school year.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions about expense? I know we keep pushing, Ms. Roaring, because we are ready to get into that revenue side, because we have heard a lot of information from the governor's office and from the Division of Budget, and we really want to see what that means in terms of this current year as well as the projected year. And so I know that that's our conversation for next week, but I think everybody is just kind of chomping at the bit. We want to get there. We want to get there. And so we appreciate everything that you're doing to keep us up to speed and to provide the information for us. From the committee members, are there any other questions or concerns that you have this evening?
Almost said, I think you guys have done a fantastic job fielding all of our inquiries, so thank you for that. It's a lot of information to digest.
Thank you.
So
yes, just a thank you from my end as well.
if you have questions, please feel free to email them into us as well. That way, if there's something that we are missing, we can make sure to have that for the next meeting. And I think at the end of the meeting, if we just kind of incorporate, are there things that you might request for the next meeting? I know that I have on my list the board presentation from last year that talks about the reductions and things like that, so that we can kind of put those pieces together and you can almost see a side-by-side comparison. And I think that will also be helpful. But if there's anything else that you would like, if you know now, that's fine. You can tell us now. If not, you can just email it to us and we'll have it for you. Okay. So thank you all so very much. We appreciate your time. And we will see you next Monday at 5:30, and we will work out the login bugs, the signing on bugs between now and then. So it'll be an easier time getting into the meeting. So thank you all so very much. Have a great evening.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Take care. Thank you.
Bye-bye.